Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, a checklist for new rule compliance. Thank you for joining us, and before we get started, I want to take a moment to go over a few administrative details. As you have noticed upon joining the webinar, everyone has been placed on mute for the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So in your GoToMeeting control panel, you'll see a questions box. Please type your questions or comments into the field and hit enter. Please note that the recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck, will be emailed to all registrants following the live webinar, and you can actually already download the PDF of the slide deck in the handouts portion of the GoToWebinar control panel. And also, just so you know, we will be doing some polling questions throughout this webinar, and we would love to have as much participation as possible, so please make sure you are ready to answer those polling questions whenever they pop up. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to get this webinar started and hand it over to our first speaker, Mr. John Kelly.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak today. I'll be speaking with Greg Prothero, my colleague from EdFX, and we're going to be talking to you a little bit about kind of an ongoing conversation we've been having with a lot of our customers in the industry about how to prepare for and respond to the proposed rules that came up, and also to the general requirements and goals of achieving interoperability as we go forward. We'll talk a little bit about what the current landscape is, how you might develop a plan, and then focus on a checklist that you can use and think about for compliance within your organization. We'd also like to, at the end, we'll have, in addition to a couple of questions in the course of the webinar. EdFX is doing a survey with WEDI at recent conferences and in various forums to kind of take a pulse of industry readiness on this. So we'd appreciate, before we kick off the Q&A question, if you might answer 4 questions online as part of the webinar. Without any further ado, can we get going? Thanks. So if you signed up for this webinar, you're probably quite aware that back in February, the ONC and CMS both released, they delivered notices of proposed rulemaking, NPRMs. And I think, maybe one of the key things to remember are a couple of things. One, the ONC rule was primarily focused on guidance and rulemaking for providers and the EMR HIT part of the industry. And the CMS rule was much more focused on payers, particularly payers who were participating in Medicare Advantage products. And the other key thing to I think about and consider to put these rules in context is these rules were offered under legislation, and the regulatory authority behind these rules and the ultimate authority for HHS to enforce compliance draws from the Cures Act. And specifically, the Cures Act has a number of sections addressing the assumption that data blocking is happening in the industry, whether it's intentional or unintentional or just an artifact of the way we take care of the US population, but that in a sense, patient data is locked in silos, and that a lot of people feel that opening up those silos, making that data more free and accessible is at the heart of improving healthcare in the United States, both from a cost and a quality perspective. Next slide. So there was a public comment period that ended in June. There were ONC NPRM received about 2013 official comments, CMS 1621. Those are all publicly available. I mean, any one of you can go out to the websites and actually read each and every one of those 3,600 comments. What I've done here is try to give some themes that did pop up across the board. In general, there was support for the ideas that patients should have access to information, that FHIR and open APIs is the way to make that happen, and that the Cures Act provisions on information blocking are generally on target. that there is, as I said, intentional or unintentional data blocking in the industry, and we need to address that. Also, some themes about what the impact was going to be. The technology shift will require significant investment on the part of the EMR and HIT vendors, a little bit less on the part of payers. And this is based on the responses that the NPRM's got. Our takeaway on that is that payers have invested in lots of technology for all kinds of data sharing between payers and providers, that they're going to leverage a lot of that, and that, you know, this is kind of things that payers do all the time, and they're always responding to regulations, and that they always have to invest in technology. They're much more concerned about the timelines and some of the business and social effects of the rules, whereas the EMR and HIT vendors have built their technology in certain ways, and they're anticipating a significant lift in terms of investment on their part. Everybody agrees that the requirements lack adequate specificity. You know, there's comments in there like, for the payers, you shall share, you know, you shall include in your APIs any information, clinical information you have on the patient. So what does any mean? That's, you know, that's the kind of statements that pop up throughout both NPRMs, and everybody agrees that needs to be addressed in any final rule. Also, the scope of information required is too broad, especially clinical. You know, again, that phrase, any information you have or that you're storing on the patient, those kind of things are felt to be not just in a, not that that shouldn't be there, that they're not thought out, but just how do you assure your compliance officer that you're compliant when you're having to write internal policies that address statements like that? The other thing that popped up a lot was this kind of guilty until proven innocent definition of information blocking. Essentially, if someone complains that you are information blocking, it's assumed that you are, unless you can point to one of 7 exceptions and say, that's the reason I'm doing what I'm doing. So essentially, information blocking is defined by what it is not instead of what it is. And although the government has done that in a number of occasions historically in rulemaking, it's still a real issue for those having to comply with the rules. Again, everybody is saying that the implementation dates, if they stood for 2020, are, I don't think it's a stretch for me to say that most people consider that insanely aggressive. But we'll see where the feds come down. There's a major blue button development conference at the White House at the end of this month, and my understanding is that one of the goals of HHS in that conference is to kind of assess just how aggressive they can be in the rule without, facing a huge blowback. And then I think the last thing is major privacy concerns for patients. If we want to make this information open and accessible to third-party apps, that patients can get their information from payers and providers and then share it with anybody they want on their cell phone. There's been a lot of commentary, both official and unofficial, and conversations in the industry saying, are patients really ready to do that? We all have the experience of, downloading an app and looking at the consent and privacy clause, and it's 15 pages on your phone, and you just scroll quickly to the bottom, you check the box, and you say yes. If you start doing that with your health information, is that going to work? And then we got to suddenly, wake up with this horrible privacy headache 6 or 8 months down the road. So there's a lot of comments. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
And I was going to mention that in the back of the deck here, we do have references to a lot of these information, right, from the rules and the comments period. So we do have a reference if you need to actually look at specific references from different organizations, just FYI.
Thank you. Next slide. So the other result that we've seen in the industry after these rules is what we're kind of calling conflation and confusion. The idea that a lot of ideas and conversations are floating around, they're kind of being conflated across, and you're talking about one thing, but maybe that's another, and then the confusion as to what actually is asked for in the rules. And what we've seen is there's in particular this idea of the phrase the blue button, some of the work the Caring Alliance is doing, and what's required in the NPRM with the US CDI. That CMS started with the blue button actually in 2010 with the Veterans Administration, and then expanded it to the whole Medicaid population being blue button 1.0. Then they introduced not too long ago blue button 2.0, which is built on FHIR APIs, built on open access. It's built on all the principles and the ideas that you see in the two NPRMs. Then there was the Cairn Alliance, who established a common payer data set. Now they published something called the Framework for the Blue Button. And so they started using the word blue button. CMS was using the word blue button. And then when the NPRM came out, I think people logically understood that what the NPRM was doing was building on the work of the Blue Button and Cairn Alliance. And then it was kind of another version of the Blue Button, 2.x, I'll call it. But as we've talked to a lot of customers and folks in the industry and heard people talking about this, it seems to be a lot of confusion among, okay, so when I say blue button, what am I talking about? And some of this comes down to, what's the role of clinical information? What's the role of US CDI, the US Core Data for Integration set that came from the EMR certification days under meaningful use? And then the term other clinical data. And then, what lines of business are we talking about? The blue button, the official one, Medicare, is Medicare Parts A, B, and D. The NPRM looks like what it's trying to do is to go after C, to close the gap. So I think a lot of payers have been talking about this and listening to vendors talk about it and listening to other people speak at conferences and whatnot. There's a little bit of confusion or discussion, at least, around, so what lines of businesses do I have to be covering to be compliant? So under the NPRM, technically, it's just going to be Medicare Advantage line of business. But a lot of folks, when they're talking about the spirit of this or talking about the Cairn Alliance version, the Cairn Blue Button framework, that's talking about all commercial populations. So this is all we're trying to say is, it's going to be good for you to be kind of educated that there is something called the CMS Blue Button 2.0 implementation guide, that there's the Cairn Alliance common payer consumer data set, and then there's the to be finalized final rules from ONC and CMS. And that if you're thinking about talking about it within your organization, if you're thinking about making plans about where do you want to step in and where do you want to begin some work, it's really important to understand the difference between kind of those three different areas. Because also while this in the NPRMs, they talk about Da Vinci, they talk about a whole lot of other things. There's a lot going on in those NPRMs, and it's important that you kind of get grounded when you're internally talking to your own people about what you want to do and when you want to do it, to really understand what your options and your choices are. Greg, did you have anything to add?
No, that's good. Thanks, Sean.
Okay, next slide. The other thing that I think is starting to emerge more clearly that wasn't, I don't think, well appreciated or understood at the outset of the NPRMs was the shift toward consumer-focused patient information exchange using these FHIR technology and APIs. And if you think about HIPAA for 20 years, it's really been about payer-to-provider communication and interchange and automation of information exchange, the development, the expansion, starting with just straight-up fee-for-service claims payment, moving to value-based care, and all the things that pretty much probably everybody in the phone's been familiar with for the last 20 years. These NPRMs don't say anything about payer-to-provider or provider-to-payer data exchange. They don't address really any of the issues around administrative simplification or problems or exchange that the industry has. They don't talk about the role of the exchange of clinical information between payers and providers around value-based care. Everything in the NPRMs is focused, because it draws from the data blocking rules under the CARES Act. Everything in there is about provider to consumer and payer to consumer data exchange. There's a little bit about payer to payer, but even that is on behalf of the consumer, where the consumer says, I'm changing health plans. I want you to export my information from my old payer to my new payer. Or going to the doctor, I'm changing doctors. You need to be able to move my information from your healthcare system over to another healthcare delivery system. And so I think that's starting to emerge, that this is kind of an obligation, onerous government intervention, but maybe this is actually the final great opportunity to compel everybody to invest in truly engaging the consumer. And although a lot of people have speculated that by putting all this information in the consumer's hands, I mean, it's a be careful what you ask for scenario, and that a whole lot of good could come about it, that patients will feel empowered, patients will become the agent of interoperability. Patients will be able to make that information available for cancer research and for other disease management research and for healthcare navigators and all kind of people that can actually help them get the most for the healthcare dollar. At the same time, as John Holomka famously said, you have Joe's endoscopy shack down the street. What are they going to do with your data when they get it? So I think that's an important thing to consider as you're thinking about when you implement this technology and comply with these rules. How can you leverage that to really take advantage of the consumer engagement opportunities? Greg, would you like to expand?
Yeah, I think you hit what we're hearing is, it's one thing to send the data, right, when by request, the data that you own or stewarding, right? But then receiving that information, right? What do you do with it once when it comes through? So, there's two-way street here, and I think that's one of the kind of challenges we've heard. So, yes.
So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but basically, if you're looking at where this is really playing out right now in the industry, there's Blueprint 2.0 is live. The Cairn Alliance is very active in leveraging standards and promulgating. The White House event at the end of this month is asking any payer who's participating, in order to participate, you have to sign a pledge, essentially, that you will implement the Cairn Common Payer Consumer Data Set. So these are a couple of initiatives that you probably want to, if you're not familiar with them, you probably should be. If you have webinars or places where you can go and learn more about them, we fully recommend that you take advantage of that, because you're going to see later in the presentation, we're in a sense making some big bets that that these frameworks for implementation are going to be at the core of a lot that our customers are going to be doing. Next slide. So Greg, do you want to talk a little bit about the challenges on these?
Yeah, and we're hearing some of this, and also some of this can be found online. But when it comes to actually, when the consumer starts directing these exchanges of data, how is this going to happen? So we have to kind of plan on both directions, and then what is actually going to be moving. A lot of data has been moving already, right? And so the plans have, a lot of plans could be on a innovation curve where they can actually do a map to FHIR. Or they'd be doing, using kind of a claim extract, right? Doing, a kind of flat file. And so right now, I'll mention a couple of things. Why we're in this kind of position is there really hasn't been an industry standard for sharing claims, right? Any kind of either post or pre-adjudicated claims. Payers right now are already sharing patient data with not only their partners, HIT vendors, right, or partners, with business associates under VAs. There are all sorts of use cases, care coordination, utilization, even for analytics. And this is typically driven around the payment processing, right? And they're using a variety of custom and proprietary extracts, so right now to get that done. If we go to the next one, right, so the EDI X12 standards, we're really designed, right, to do the revenue and payment cycle. So that would be between the payers and providers, so that's traditional. Not really sharing this data now at scale with any open, if you will, with consumers or members, if they think that. So, we're really looking at this first step at the, claim data, looking at acknowledgements that are going back and forth, right, and, data that's living in these 835s, remittance or EOB data. And then, right now you have to play to the least common denominator. So if health plans are generating these claims extracts from their adjudication systems, you still have to work with those. And how do you get those? You might be using some tooling like an ETL tool or some type of process to start that. So you have to kind of work at that level, right? Pull that data up, and then also maybe even work at a higher level when you come to the innovative technology. So, there's going to be a couple of challenges here when it gets down to brass tacks of actually, getting these things mapped into a framework and working. John, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think really just one comment, in general, the issue is this, and this gets back to that comment earlier about, where the public comments came back. The plans have largely been automating a lot of data exchange for all kinds of reasons, as Greg stated, and they've invested, tens of millions, if not hundreds, maybe $1 billion or more in infrastructure that helps payers move data, but none of it is designed around the models for direct to patient and consumer data that are being anticipated in the NPRMs. So if, again, I cited, if you want to stay kind of close to this, the real people who are driving the conversation, obviously CMS, ONC at healthit.gov, the White House Office of American Innovation, is intervention. They are doing. They're starting to pick up the ball and seeing that this is a major issue for healthcare. It's at the heart of any meaningful solutions in bending the trend. And then the industry work groups that are out there are helping define the standards and wave the flag and try to get people to adopt. Or the Karen Alliance. Care Journey, which is Anish Chopra's company, and Anish Chopra, really going back to 2010, is the father of the Blue Button, and has championed the cause really for the best part of almost 20 years now, I guess. And then Da Vinci, who's been working very aggressively on the use cases for payer and provider exchange, but is promoting the exact technologies that are going to be required under the proposed rules.
I'll just mention Da Vinci is adding cases for consumer rights, so there are planning to do implementation models for that as well. So they're seeing that the relevance here. So just want to add that.
Yep, thank you. So the roadmap for what we're calling industry alignment, how do you as stakeholders in the industry align with the developments of what's anticipated in the NPRM and some of the other active, the activities going on in the marketplace? And this is kind of a historical approach, but it aligns with how people are adopting. We're talking to a lot of customers across the industry, payers in particular, who are asking us for, advice, help, support in implementing things. And what we're seeing is, if you go back to the early days of the Blue Button 1.0 that I talked about, and payers sharing information directly with consumers, it was really a portal world. The original Blue Button was VA and CMS basically saying, okay, you're my Medicare customers, you're my veteran customers, I'm going to make this stuff available to you. You can go on a website, you can take a look at it, you can even maybe download a little bit of it or whatever. And then, the kind of general acceptance by the Obama administration, and continuing actually quite vigorously under the current administration, Blue Button 2.0 being released, saying, you know what, this is really working. Let's expand this. Let's adopt those principles of open API access that we've been talking about. The structure of the Blue Button anticipated and was leveraged extensively in the proposed rules coming out. And so to fill in the gap for Medicare Part C that was missing, where the Blue Button was servicing the recipients of A, B, and D, it led to the Medicare rule saying, we want you to do on your website what we're already doing in production in 2.0. How big a deal can it be? That's the position essentially of the CMS NPRM. We're already doing this. Why can't you just do it for your at least for your Medicare Advantage population? The Karen Alliance going one step further and saying, look what Blue Button's doing. Look at the model. How can we make this really broad-based application of patient access to information across the industry, across all lines of business? Let's consolidate as a commercial payer industry around a common data set that we all accept and sign off on and make a pledge. Yes, at the very least, here's our baseline. So taking the technology, building off of 2.0, leveraging the same technology framework and saying, okay, let's add certain types of content. Let's, expand upon that. And then the two NPRMs under the Cures Act drew on all of that work and said, you know what, let's go all the way. Let's make it wide open APIs. Let's use OAuth. Let's use RESTful services. And let's include all of the clinical data that we've already required the NPRMs to include. I'm sorry, that we've already required the EHRs to include under meaningful use. And let's really go to make this happen on a large scale across all patient information and eliminate data blocking. And so that parallel of information, I think Greg's going to talk about how, we have actually been engaged in this. Greg, do you want to pick up there?
Yeah, just on a roll, man. You can keep on going if you want.
No, go ahead.
All right. So, we have been, and if you go back into history, right, we have been connecting to either providers for the EMR, right, looking into clinical systems and pulling this data, or even doing it manually, right? But so we have been looking at the clinical side, right, or connecting to providers to get data a long, long time ago, maybe the proprietary APIs, right, that we've been building. So in a historical lens, we've been doing the same thing, but it's kind of been split, right? And then moving into the new standard APIs, starting to standardize, right, the HIE kind of the idea of the exchanges kind of, came out through the Obama, right, and trying to bring all this data together. We did integrations to HIEs, right? We used IHE protocols. We use Direct now to secure the data and do trusted networks. So we've been doing this to move this like semi-clinical data, right, or patient data, and then all of a sudden FHIR and open APIs start coming up, and then we say, all right, what are we going to put on top of this? How do we use this new information that's being unleashed, right? So the smart APIs, smart applications on FHIR now became, how do I build on top of it? And so in this time frame, we're building applications that are, this data now has been in a resource and available. We've been building applications that we can pull from that and do better things with, right? Innovative things. And then so as we move forward, we're just going to continue to leverage this, and the concept of trusted exchanges will come through, right? The idea of moving this data to potentially through an HIE or a qualified health, qualified health, what is it called? What is that one, John? The resource? The
qualified health information
plan. Yeah, so they're going to be coming through, and they're going to be all compliant. And so you can see these kind of merging, right? The trusted exchanges, and then on top of the consumer and all the data, the clinical data and claim data, all in one. And the idea that this could be a one framework for compliance is now growing, right? It's coming together, it's merging, it's patient member data, it's all data. We've been doing this, so there's a kind of emergence we see coming through. So it's where you start on this continuum. I think it's working together inside organizations to make this happen. Anything else?
I guess all I'm trying to say, I think what we're both trying to say with this slide is though, especially from a payer perspective, a lot of this stuff coming out, people said, oh, this is a lot of lift, this is a lot to do. But I think what we're trying to highlight is this rational approach where you leverage investments you've already been making for the last 10 years in the exchange of information between payers and providers, and then see how much that you can take advantage of, and then focus in on what you need to add to your existing infrastructure in order to achieve compliance under these various scenarios.
Great. All right. So we get into a little bit, and we're not going to go too deep in some of the reference details of the frameworks for moving patient data, but we did want to do a kind of a side-by-side comparison, pulling up a couple of categories that we see are kind of prime, right? And we actually have something that we've sent out as well, kind of a primer on what's needed. And at the end, you'll see a checklist. But if we start just on the left-hand side, talking Blue Button 2.0, and then how the Karen Blue Button framework is kind of extended that, we have to talk about member access, right? The build of standard APIs using FHIR, right? The idea of the use case of payer to consumer exchanges and the eligibility and benefit information being exchanged. Then we have to talk about governance, using OAuth was here. The idea that an application needs to be, or an application or user has to register to use these new URLs or access methods. That's sort of like the early stage of auditing and consent and kind of certifying applications. And then we have to think about the FHIR resources, what versions, what standards are being used. So if we talk, the EOB patient and coverage data is really kind of the focus point of the Blue Button. At CMS, the IG, those are guidelines. We use the DS2 version 2, right? Which right now, pretty much over 80% of hospitals use a lot of these earlier standards, version 2. And so there's a wide adoption of version 2. What's happening now is Karen is going to be taking this into the version 4 and building maps out for those in their implementation guides. And then then this actually new data set called the CPCDS, which we've already mentioned, really starts adding the additional claims and payment data. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those new elements that are in this. And then still have to have the terminology, coding, and call outs, right, that are all part of this. So the terminology and code sets that are relevant. Well, I won't name them here, but if you look them up, they all have to be there. And then we think about, where does the data come from? Where's your SORs, right? Where's your sources of data? And this could come from claim systems, membership data, billing systems, whatever you think your system of record is, or even we'll talk about some other different systems that you can pull this data from. John, did you want to mention the move to Karen real quick before we go into MQM?
Yeah, I think the key thing we're trying to show is that we've heard a lot of kind of fear and uncertainty and doubt around what's this all going to mean. What we're trying to lay out here for you is that each of these are progressive frameworks. Blue Button 2.0 has a base. The Karen framework is adding and building off of that base to expand the accessibility to the Blue Button 2.0 and to make it more relevant to the U.S. healthcare population at large.
Perfect. And then when we move into the next framework, right, if we think about the interoperability framework, these partner interactions now become open, right? You have to now manage open APIs, right? The idea that you might be connecting to trusted exchanges, right, for this data. The consumer now drives payer-to-payer and payer-to-provider kind of exchanges. They're really directing that. And then the concept of care coordination of use cases now have to be brought into the mix. Governance stays with 2.0, right? But the framework of consent now has to be thought about, right? The idea of auditing the lineage of this data moving has to be thought of. There's mention of certain data segmentations for privacy. You can look up DS42, DS4P, right? That's exactly some of the new technology, or actually not the technology, the way of doing the segmentation. And then we think about the FHIR resources that are being added, the clinical data to the same EOB data that's there, and moving it now to a new version of the FHIR standard. This concept of ARC, right, the API resource collection, is standardizing what the API will look like, which actually then will be calling the resources into the data set, which is the US CDI data set, right, moving forward. Then finally, the common coding systems for clinical, right, now have to be added. And then source data for this will now include clinical applications. It could be, repositories that are using this information. So you see now that the data sources involved and expand and accelerate. So you have to start thinking about where that information is as well. So yeah, we're moving forward into this kind of common area. Anything else there before we want to move forward?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so this digs down just a little bit. If we think about the CPCDS, right, what is it, right? This data model is really the expansion and the normalization of the CMS implementation guides that has EOB data, claim data, right, comprehensive and generic. I look on the left-hand side. Then we're moving, and what Karen does well is now it's going to start mapping these into FHIR resources like patient coverage, explanation of benefits. These FHIR resources are being mapped, right, to the traditional data that we have. Some of the ones on the right-hand side, the difference is, and when we think about enhancing is, you might take out the claim PCP MPI number that wasn't there before under the CMS one. So with the CPCDS, we actually include this. And right now, I think, if we think about it, there's multiple data elements that are being added to increase use cases and increase usage, right? So that's where this new data set comes through. If we compare that now with the US CDI, which means the NPRM rules, right, you're now focused really on clinical, right, or mostly, you're adding this clinical aspect and all this clinical data. And at the top, you'll see the ARC, right? We have the standard APIs. But what you're really trying to do now is understand where these data sources in context and identify which ones needs to be mapped. And, from a historical perspective, if you're familiar with the CCDS, right, the common data sets back in 2015, you're pretty familiar. The changes are adding clinical notes and provenance to this. And John, I'm not sure if you want to mention anything about this, but I think the idea of this is to really move forward, right, and expand from that 21st Century Cures Act, right, the latest draft. So.
Yeah, I think just simply, just to summarize here on the USCDI, the reason why USCDI is important is because that's the set of data that is mandated that the EHRs be able to exchange with each other, right? So here's your data set that we know we should be able to guarantee is available in the course of patients being cared for. The ARCH takes and maps all of those data elements that are being collected and mandated under Meaningful Use 3 and is required for the certification of EHR, and then maps all of those data elements to the FHIR data resources. And so that's where they link together. The other important thing about USCDI is that thing I mentioned before about the parts of the rule that say, any information, quote unquote, that you have. Well, USCDI at least creates what under HIPAA we used to call the designated record set. If you're housing these information, then that's covered under the legislation. Other stuff that you might be keeping in a file or a folder or a file cabinet or not law chart, kind of written in care utilization care system notes, those are out of bounds. So the US CDI gives you a grounded set of saying, okay, if I'm keeping any of this information on a patient, then this stuff is all fair game for being required in any legislation that comes out. And so that's why it's important to kind of understand what US CDI is, and then also understand that if you're going to be sending that information to anybody else, you got to be looking at the FHIR resources to which that data is mapped under the ARCH.
So that's a good point, because a lot of people have asked questions about structured and unstructured data being available, right? From a clinical perspective, right? You might be holding unstructured information in image repositories. I mean, how do you pull that data back out? If it doesn't map to a resource, you're saying that you're going to be okay, or is this kind of?
Well, I'm saying as you've got highlighted on the screen in USCDI, it says clinical notes structured or unstructured. So that tells you that if you've got unstructured data that maps to any of these, categories like clinical notes, medications, problems, procedures, then that's fair game for inclusion in the final rule.
Fair enough. I know that's a question that's been coming to all of our customers and clients out there. So you want to move some of the barriers, right?
Yeah, quickly, because I want to make sure we have time to get to some of the other more important stuff. But the version mappings in FHIR, still a lot of them yet to be defined. The standards for bulk load of data are still wide open, a lot of conversation. FHIR mapping back to your legacy and internal systems, it will adjust that a little bit in the checklist. CCDA mapping to FHIR. There are maps out there that will take your CCDA and HL7 standard, historical documents, and map those to FHIR, but those still need some fill in. Consent management, it's the Wild West still. I mean, I think it's the one area where everybody's worried about it, and there's no clear standard. And what that comes down to for a lot of you in the audience is liability. How do I say to my CFO and my CEO and my CXO, whatever, don't worry, I got you covered. So if you don't have a good consent management approach, at least in a good faith argument that you're complying with whatever the community standard is, you're on shaky, thin ice. Third-party app development and registration. I mean, that's still open the door. I heard someone from the Care Journey and Anisha's group mentioned that they thought that it would just be going with Apple. As long as Apple certifies it for the App Store, then you're fine. Well, okay. I don't know if, again, payers are going to be comfortable with that layer of accepting liability and unless Apple takes responsibility. So these are the kind of questions that are still barriers, and these are the questions that the Secretary is wrestling with in terms of what are they going to put in the final rule.
All right, so we got to get to the first survey question. I think we're a little bit over time, so we'll try to speed up a little bit faster. Let's try to get this first survey in. Sam, can you load this one up? So I'll mention it while it's loading. Are you planning to implement any of the following reference models? So we mentioned the Blue Button 2.0, the Karen CPCDS, right? Or we would call that the framework, Karen framework for Blue Button. Any requirements set forth in the final rule, and then we touched on some of the Da Vinci use cases, so I think some of people are doing that. So if you could quickly throw in your answers, and we can. Okay.
Well, that's interesting because the final rules are probably the high bar. So if that's what you're looking at right now, it puts you in good shape. Okay, next slide.
Yep. Going to go into
so developing your plan.
Yeah. Do you want to mention how
Yeah. So again, I mentioned before that the Karen framework is something we're using to build off of. So Greg's going to talk a little bit about, we're showing slides that Karen is also sharing publicly that talk about an approach you could take.
Yeah, and I'll make this pretty brief. Is the idea that data is coming from multiple either adjudication systems or different systems or records. They might be proprietary. You can directly map to FHIR, right? If you have the tools and the framework, or as what Karen is saying, you can take a flat file format and map to a flat file, and then map to a FHIR resource. So you can see there's multiple options popping up here to move forward with meeting compliance. the idea that you can leverage this framework in multiple ways definitely leads to a couple of questions you want to do is like, where is your data and how you're going to be receiving this data? And as you see on the far right-hand side, once it becomes FHIR enabled, even at the Medicare side at the bottom, FHIR resources then could be consumed by the consumer applications or any applications out there. So I won't go into too much detail because we have a couple more slides that go more detail, and you can pull these off of the Cairn website that we referenced at the bottom. But you can see with the CPCDS here, now you have implementation guides, not only for the, as they call it, the flat file bridge spec, but you can also do specific queries, right, and map directly into the FHIR resource. So depending on where your data is at, so if it's, moving from plans, right, to plan, or even in your internal system where you're pulling this data to load it into a resource, you now have a couple of options to do this now under the Cairn framework. Any questions here or any other comments here, John, before we move forward?
Nope, good.
Okay, so I think I mentioned the two here. The top is mapping directly to a FHIR profile, and then the other is using a flat file bridge. And then the other idea is like kind of leveraging that common mapping to a FHIR resource. So there's really kind of two options here. You want to go into some of the challenges here?
Yeah, I think the main thing I think we hope you can take away is that Cairn is presenting a model that anyone can comply with and gives them kind of like a baseline low-tech approach toward getting to where you want to get to, which is making that data available as FHIR resources and APIs. I think in our experience with our customers and the observation that we're making is that because of the history of data exchange, we believe that a lot of you in the industry, many of you, most of you, if not, are actually capable of certainly moving directly to mapping directly with FHIR profiles, not necessarily having to use old-fashioned ETL processes in the middle. ETL processes are great, but that means every time anything changes, a standard changes or data sources change, now you're retooling a file, you're having to test it, you have to make sure that it's mapped to all the right places. And the whole process, if you have to change, even more than once a year, gets to be pretty onerous. So, I think what you're going to see in our rational approach is that leverage tools you probably already have in many cases or can acquire and implement easily, build on the infrastructure you have, and then actually achieve the Cairn goals with a much more flexible and cost-effective approach. So what that leads us to is what we'll call the implementation model, and so what we're thinking you should do is if you're building a Microsoft project plan, you want to start off before you do your work breakdown structure, take a look and see what are the key things, the deliverables, the requirements that you've got to think about before you start the project. So first of all, identify the available data sources, the data that you want to expose. If you're looking at the NPRM, as many of you said you are, you're looking at a whole lot of data sources in the organization. If you're just looking at Blue Button or the Cairn implementation, you're limiting your data sources to essentially claims and EOBs. But if you do it the right way, you can always add clinical and more data later. You've got to have a FHIR data repository and you've got to have a FHIR data server. So you need to make sure that you have those. You have to implement a FHIR-based API validator. So you've got your FHIR data server, and your repository. How are you going to let that talk to the outside world? And that's where the FHIR-based integration layer comes in. Then you got to be able to link your backend data to whatever that FHIR infrastructure and repository is. Again, a lot of ways you can do that. You can use ETL, you can use dynamic services, you can use web services, and any of the cool fancy technology that many of you probably have in your enterprise. But you just have to figure out what's your strategy for linking that backend data. And maybe the most important thing there is make sure that as more data becomes available in the backend and the source data, that you have a strategy that's flexible enough to add more things without rebuilding everything. The other thing is, centralizing mapping for control over data standard versions, USCDI version 1, FHIR version 3, FHIR version 4. These are all going to change a lot over the next 5 years. And so if you've got to have a lot of manual work to step up and step down data and standards at the edge of the organization, it's going to be a slow, unresponsive approach towards staying current in a world where compliance may be really critical. Also, you've got to get comfortable with using OpenAuth. If you don't know anything about it, you've got to build an OpenAuth framework. You got to hire people or train people in the organization who know how to deal with and deploy OpenAuth. And if you don't know what OpenAuth is, when you log onto an application, they go, you can sign in with Facebook if you want. You don't have to create an account. That's open. That's a most common example of OpenAuth, where you've got an account with one application, another application wants to grant you an account, and you go, oh, you don't have to give me an account, just use your account with Facebook. That's a scary thing in healthcare. Build a transparency platform. If you're going to open this up, if you're going to incur possible liability, you got to be able to track, log, audit, and report. The good news is you're probably a covered entity, and this is not news to you. You just got to ramp it up when you start to think about consent. And that's where you have to establish a consent management framework. You have to be able to know not just, are you who you say you are, and should I give the data to you? You have to say, are you who you say you are? Should I give the data to you? And who do you want to give other data to? And of the 15 pieces of data I have on you, which ones you want to be able to give to which people, and which ones you want to make sure that those people don't get? You've now entered, the three-dimensional chess world here. And then this adoption and process for certifying applications to third-party data access. If we end up where we're delegating that to Apple or the Google Play Store, then great. I don't think that's where we're going to be. So you got to figure out, if your member says, send my data to Angry Birds for healthcare, are you going to do it? And if you are or aren't going to do it, are you basing that on some kind of certification process? Because you'll have to be able, if you say to the patient, I'm not going to send it to Angry Birds for healthcare, then you got to say why, and you got to be able to point to a policy. So at a very high level, no matter what you do, no matter what implementation, whether it's Blue Button 2.0, whether it's the Karen framework for the Blue Button, or whether you're going for the the whole thing and going for the NPRM and the final rule, these are the common requirements across all of them. Greg, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's good. Actually, good explanations too, right? But we got to start somewhere, right? So how do we take the rational approach to this?
So I think, as I said, you start with that baseline, because that supports all of them. And Greg, if you want to talk about how our strategy is, you start with the baseline and build, and decide
sure.
where you want to come in.
You mentioned, so we try to take the top 9, if you will, or all 9 of those, and kind of map them to a kind of a rational approach, right? And this could change to yours if you're turning in different directions, but the idea that you build a framework, right, or a baseline that will do 1 through 7, right? If you take the 1 through 7, build the find the data, build the servers, right? Find the data that you're going to link to, do the consent, right? Do the OAuth, build the transparency. Don't do the consent. Yeah, that's the next one. But then data management, and then build a transparency framework, right? And if you start that early and you just do the Blue Button 2.0, well, then you're in good shape to do the Karen, right? And then just by moving, if you move to the Karen, then you're just changing the maps, right? Or adding new guidelines, right? Or doing even some customized mapping if you have to, but you have 2 options to do direct maps, or you can use the bridge map with Karen, right? And then at the Karen level, if you hadn't established that consent, this is where it would be coming in, right? Really, really adopting a consent framework that is robust. And then if we keep on moving up this kind of, the reference framework, if we move out to the, the future, you'll be now opening up those APIs that you standardize on the baseline. You're opening it up and you'll be supporting the ARC, right? And then number 5, you'll be updating the centralized maps to support the new data sets, right? And then you'll move, in the Karen, you move to 4. Here you'll be kind of utilizing the same, version 4 FHIR maps, but you'll be actually mapping those to the different data sets that are internal, so the USCDI data map. And then finally, when you go to NPRM, we mentioned 9 here that you need to somehow adopt a certification for a third-party process. That's something you need to think about, and that's sort of in question right now. So we kind of left that off the checklist when we moved to the other. Is there anything else that I missed, John?
Nope, I think we're good. Why don't you go ahead and with the consolidated framework that we're recommending?
Yeah, so the idea now is, don't build multiple times, right? Think about how you can leverage some of your technologies that you already have invested in, or how you can start consolidating because of the TCOs, reduced TCOs, right? You want to build efficiencies. And so how do you really consolidate and centralize now both these current and potential future reference models? The idea on the right-hand side, as we were talking before, is really identify those sources, right? Are these SORs, right? If they're or are they actually data sites that you need to be pulling data from? Think about different transaction repositories you have that might store some of this principal data, right? Think about claims and payment, even clearinghouses, even billing systems, all of your different partners that might own some of your data that you need to look for. Obviously, the core systems will be the primary. We put that right in the middle. And then when we move into NPRMs, it's like, all right, well, not even NPRMs, but even some of the payer infrastructure, some of the patient information, right? Even some of your CRM tools might have some data that you need to pull from. So how do you leverage that? And then finally into clinical PBMs, labs, XCDRs or CDRs, and any data warehouses or clinical repositories. What is that standard data and how you pull that from it? So you need to be pulling that into kind of a high level common, if you will, infrastructure where you have the ability to do integration and mapping. You do the code set call outs, right? And you have runtimes. The idea that you can now leverage the APIs and mapping that to a FHIR server and repository, and then obviously taking that data and auditing it somehow in a governance and security, all working together, all integrated, no customizations except for moving the connects. And then we layer on these new guidelines that will change. So if you are going to go down the CMS 2.0, put that guideline on top, right? If you're going to go down the Karen, implement those guidelines, right? If you're going to go even into smart applications and in DaVinci, take those implementation models that are being developed in the industry, start leveraging those on. And then hopefully the end part, you have this standard API, right? Or a standard open API, this where that can be consumed by applications that are trusted, consumers that are that need the data, payers that we're going to be pushing to the information form because you might be moving data from you to another payer, right? And then providers maybe, and anybody out there who's trusted. So you have a standardized out front. So the idea that you simplify this and think about it at a long term is what we're thinking about, right? Just leverage what you have, think about consolidating and don't building new. So, John,
and I think the only, yeah, I think the only thing,
I think there's some stuff that we're still probably going to have to build, but the idea of a framework is what we're trying to get to.
Yeah, and I think what we're really trying to encourage people on here is that if you have organizational focus on these things like the Blue Button, Karen, or the NPRM, the infrastructure we're proposing here in terms of adding that FHIR API layer to the edge of the enterprise, connecting it in a kind of services-based way to the back-end sources. Not only do you get your compliance and the goals for the organization that they're focused on, but you can then also, pretty much with no lift at all, be participating in other innovative things you want to do, like smart and FHIR applications with your partners and provider network, and also participate in the DaVinci use case and some of the other value-based care stuff. You're basically getting all of that other stuff at the cost of just compliance.
Yeah, great. So I think we're into our next survey question. So I'll read it while it's being loaded. Do you currently expose any of the following data to members, right? That's the EOB, any claim data, claim history, lab data getting into clinical, right? Medication history, and then all patient data, which would be interesting if I see anyone saying all patient data at this point, but we had to put it in there, right, John?
Yeah.
Please go ahead and mark which one's appropriate.
So I think this is consistent with what we kind of assumed, and that the really good news is for Blue Button 2.0 and for the Karen common payer data set, those rely on EOB and claims. So you're already exposing the information. So that's kind of consistent with our observation that focus on figuring out how to easily and cleanly integrate that dynamically with some kind of a FHIR-based edge of the enterprise infrastructure. And now you're very rapidly in place to participate on the open API world, and you're set up for compliance once the final rules come out. Next slide.
Right.
So I think, yeah, I've kind of gone through the checklist essentially with this presentation. If you do nothing else, we're making it available. You can rip this page off and talk to your colleagues, your peers, your bosses, your project managers, and say, look, I need to be compliant. What am I doing about these 8 things? If you got these 8 things covered, you're in pretty good shape relative to most of the folks in the industry right now. So we'll make that available. And with that, I think we we'll entertain some questions. We'll also, as we did last time, any questions
Well,
we
the
can
readiness
address.
survey. You
Yep,
want to do the
we
readiness
will. I
survey?
just want to say we'll get to the questions. Get your questions into the question field in the box. And while you're doing that, we're going to give you a readiness survey. Just to remind you, this is a readiness survey that we're participating in, and we're sharing all the data with WEDI so that they can kind of keep an ongoing track of the pulse of folks. So we've got these 4 quick questions, if you wouldn't mind answering before we close out.
And I'll just mention that we will share some of this data right at the end once we start collecting this. So it's public information. We're going to be sharing some of this. So I'll read it as you go. At what stage of the implementation process is your organization currently? So if you choose A, you're just learning about these rules, right? B, you're planning and budgeting. C, you're researching. D, contracting and implementing already. And then E would be have a solution already in place. All right, we appreciate that. And then the next one, if you load the next one. Second was, given everything we've discussed, what do you anticipate will be your biggest challenge going forward? So if A is really the lack of expertise or SHME, if you will, information or knowledge, limited funding, as we already mentioned, the implementation timeframes, the lack of clarity on requirements, and then developing an internal compliance roadmap. Please go ahead and select these. And if you were on our last webinars, these are very similar questions. We're trying to stay exactly the same so we can consolidate the answers.
And it's okay to answer the survey again, because what we're providing with WEDI is kind of trending over time, so that hopefully people will edge up the curve in terms of readiness.
Great. And our third one is, which of the 5 proposed requirements would be the most challenging? Moving to a bidirectional health information sharing, sharing historical claim data, coordinating care with health plans, participating in a trust health plan, or making the provider directories available through APIs, which we didn't mention too much today, but I think on our last call we really did, is talk about how we connect and update or utilize provider directories. All right. All right, and then our final one, would you like to learn more about really the adopting and implementing of FHIR standards, developing APIs for the Blue Button and provider directories? We'll focus on the Blue Button on this question. Establishing a connection with a trusted HIE, designing an internal roadmap, or meeting with requirements while still ensuring the security and governance of data. So this will be the last one, and then I think we'll have a few minutes for questions, right, John?
Yes. And again, I'll emphasize, as we did last time, any questions that you submit that don't get answered, we will send that out through WEDI.
Okay. So are there any open questions in there? I didn't see any.
Okay, well,
Did you see any? Sam, is there any questions that are on the internal?
Yeah, there are actually a few questions that folks have put in. If you guys would like to take a minute and answer one, and then we can follow up afterwards.
Yeah, I think we're going to probably have to follow up with just to throw us one, and let's see if John and I can answer them.
So the first question that was asked, isn't Blue Button primarily focused on claims data? What is being done with clinical data?
Yep, great question, John. I think we took most of the time to talk about this, right? You want?
Well, yeah, I think simply, yeah, the Blue Button 2.0 and the Blue Button Caring Framework are focused on claims, payment, and encounter data. Maybe the most important thing about what's happening right now is a lot of payers, when you shift to the care, and the much stronger emphasis in terms of a pledge on sending out the allowed amount. And although you send the allowed amount through your portals to your members, and you send it out through the EOBs or the EOPs, Making that available to a third-party app on a cloud-based service that could then take all of the allowed amounts from all of the members for all of the payers, they could spreadsheet and disclose your actual contractual information. And so that is one of the big questions that's floating around now in terms of making a commitment to that. So it's true, Blue Button 2.0 with Medicaid information, fee schedules are fairly public, no big deal, just claims and payment information. Get to care and add a little more information, add a lot of amounts on commercial populations. Now suddenly you got a little bit of a controversy. The clinical information really doesn't get required until you get to thinking about the final rule in the NPRM. But some payers are considering sending that out through this infrastructure because you've got a lot of medication history, you've got a lot of labs, and if you can use that to leverage some of your value-based care initiatives, you know, then all the better as long as you're controlling access to third parties.
So we're right at the hour. I want to be respectful, but just a couple of things. We are going to be at WEDI Summer, right, Sam? Where I think we're going to be presenting there along with other potential vendors in here in this industry, but pretty much we think that we're stakeholders in the community, so you'll be there presenting as well. So that's that information, and then as I mentioned at the end, if you needed references to some of the comments that John mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we do have references and links to some of the comments that happened on the NPRM rules. So we appreciate everyone's time. Johnny, you want to say goodbye?
Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it. Hope we see you at WEDI.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.